I'm Emma Louise Coffey and you're welcome to the Dairy Edge, the Teagasc Dairy podcast. We're bringing you the latest information, insights and opinion to improve dairy farm performance. On this week's episode of the Dairy Edge, dairy specialist George Ramsbottom gives advice on the key areas to improve farm profits in the year ahead.
There are a number of areas that we focus on, Emma Louise, to try and rise profitability at farm level. The first would be in terms of farm output. And if we focus in on the dairy end of it, which is the end we're most interested in, things that will increase the kind of farm growth output will be stuff like the milk price being received. So where competition is really good versus farms where competition is pretty poor, you could see differences, easily see differences on a gross output basis of 4 and 5 cents per litre between some of the better farmers and some of the poorer farmers in terms of milk composition. And of course, higher versus lower cell count as well. So that'd be one area we'd look at. The second area we'd look at in terms of growth output would be to do with the sales of stock relative to the cows. So, for example, farms that sell cows in very poor condition, just as they're coming out of the parlour, will have a lower growth output than farms where they're selling cows that are in milk at calving time. So highly fertile farms will have more cows being sold that are in milk and of higher value than cows that are sold, just out of the parlour at the end of the lactation because they're empty or lame or whatever it is. So where fertility is really good, or things like lameness can be kept under control, you'll have big differences there in terms of growth output other than cows. The second thing there on the growth output side would be to do with the sales of stock other than cows, such as calves. So on farms where fertility is really good, there's going to be much higher sales of calves compared to farms where there's a poor fertility performance on the farm and less calves for sale per 100 cows. And then, of course, things like breed choice creeps into it there as well. So on farms where there's a proportionately more beef calves being born in the line of, say, for example, Angus or Hereford calves, to add value to the later born calves on farm, that again will increase the gross output side of the house. So now that we talked about output, the second area where we can increase profitability levels will come from the costs of production side of the equation. So if we think then within that and look at the variable costs, the kind of big ones that we can make inroads in will be around things like feed costs. So very high levels of meal feeding. Any the analysis that we've done in the past will show that not all meal that's fed is profitable meal. So typically we target meal levels, feeding levels for spring calving farms of between 500 and 700 kilos of feed per cow per year. Now this year was a basket case in terms of the level of feed that people had to feed because of the dry weather that we experienced across the summer. But typically where between 500 and 700 kilos of meal is being fed per annum, that will be delivering costs of between 150 and 100 and 200 euro per cow, or that's about 3 to 4 cents of feed cost per 5,000 litre cow. So if we can keep feed costs reasonably low, it'll obviously help to keep the production costs down fairly substantially. The second kind of cost we look at there will be fertiliser costs, and typically we'll see costs in the order of 120 to 150 euro per cow in terms of fertiliser costs. So that's working somewhere between 2 and 3 cents per litre for fertiliser costs. So they'll be the big two. And I suppose if we think about the fertiliser costs, the one you don't skimp on is certainly lime, because lime is feeding the soil, it's keeping the indexes of P and K right, and it's making more nitrogen available as well. So even though lime might seem like it's a capital investment, in terms of cost saving, it's one that absolutely encouraged that the maximum is used to keep the soil pH correct and provide enough of the other nutrients to the plants in the field to grow.
And I suppose just to come in on that, like lime is so cheap to spread, and the levels of lime being spread across the country are very low.
Yeah, so the lime that's being spread in the country is way below what's needed. And my rule of thumb is 90% of the country got 2 tons of lime. We could make fairly substantial savings in PK and nitrogen over the next couple of years because of the beneficial effect that would have. It yield a return of 3 or 4 to 1, most certainly. So lime is the one you do not skimp on, nearly irrespective of the year that you're talking about. Now, this year gone by there, 2018, has been a crazy year in terms of what's happened on the cost side of things. So we'll be looking typically at higher meal feeding levels, typically maybe half a ton more meal fed that would be in the order of around 3 cents per litre more meal fed in 2018 compared to 2017, which was an absolute pet year. And assuming we get back to fairly normal grass growing conditions in 2019, we're hoping to see a big reduction in both meal feeding levels, and hopefully with the same output being achieved in 2019 as was achieved in 2018.
So just to pick up on a few points that you've made, George, in terms of milk price, you have said that good composition will drive a higher milk price in the region of 4 to 5 cents per litre. In terms of the composition, we can control some of that in terms of management. What are the key factors that would drive composition in terms of nutrition and management on farms?
So when we look at what drives composition at farm level, the big driver, as far as I'm concerned, when I look at the data, is the X factor, which is the human factor. So things like early turnout to grass, a long grazing season, they have a huge impact, particularly on protein content that's being fed. The second thing is obviously the genetic component of the herd. So genetics will explain about 60% of the variation in terms of the difference between farms in terms of the milk output being attained. And the third thing that will drive it will be the lactation length. So herds that are more fertile with lots of cows calving towards the start of the calving season and then having a long lactation through into the autumn and early winter, those herds will typically have the highest composition that's achievable at farm level. So really, a lot of this is being driven by decisions around the kind of genetics you want to have in your herd, and then secondly by how well you manage the herd subsequently. I suppose you might say that to me that we can't turn the genetics around in 1 year, but I suppose the answer to that is no, you can't. But in the medium to longer term, the breeding program that's put in place this coming season will determine the type of herd that you have in a couple of years' time. And the sooner you start to really ramp up the genetic merit of the herd for composition, the faster you're going to make the gains that you need to be achieving to achieve a very high milk price in the years ahead.
And then if we focus on costs, George, like you gave us a nice guide in terms of what we'd expect feed and fertiliser to be. So your feed coming in at 3 to 4 cents per litre and your fertiliser coming in at maybe 2 to 3 cents. What should that look like on your profit monitor? Is that correct at those levels, or should it look different?
So they'll be based on milk production output in the order of around 5 to 5,500 litres per cow. With 9% solid, or close to 9% solid, which is a pretty high target, you'd be talking about delivering or producing around 450 to 470 kilos of milk solid per cow with those. So we talk about kind of total variable and fixed costs in the order of around the 20 cent mark. That's before your own labour, before bank charges or taxation are taken into account. So you're talking about in the order of around 20 cents per litre of production costs, or costs on a per cow basis of around 1,000 to 1,100 euro. And then we're talking about a gross output figure with a base price of 30 cents per litre for milk and a milk price achieved of around 32 or 3 cents per litre and gross output of around 35. You're talking about a margin there of somewhere between 13 and 15 cents per litre for the profit to accommodate your own labour, bank charges and taxation. So that would deliver a net profit per cow in a ballpark figure of around 750 euro per cow off a base of 30 cents per litre milk price. And it would deliver on a per hectare basis, stock to the cow to the hectare, it will deliver over 2,000 euro of a net profit per hectare on the dairy hectares farmed.
Yeah. And I suppose another question in relation to that, should the fertiliser be higher in terms of, you were saying 2 to 3 cents per litre, should it be higher?
Well, I tell you, warning signals. Look at where you start with the fertiliser is establish what your P and K indices are, and if you're to maintain it, your fertiliser targets will be kind of slightly individual, because in some farms there'll be more build-up of P and K required than other farms. So yes, it may be too low on some farms, but it may be a bit on the high side in others where they're only trying to maintain the P and K levels on those farms. And as I said before, that the pH is a critical factor in determining availability and the index of P and K on the farm.
You mentioned that on average, farms fed an extra half tonne of meal, which cost in the region of 3 cents per litre. Is that the only additional costs farmers are seeing as a result of the year that we've had, or do we expect additional increased costs?
I said on average the difference in meal feeding levels was I would have expected, just talking to farmers and advisors about it, was about half a tonne, but it's hugely variable, absolutely massively variable. So in the southeast of the country, really from Laois down into the bottom right hand corner of Ireland, you'll have seen substantially more meal on average than that's fed. The west and northwest had a reasonably favourable year. The big ticket item was meal. But indeed, on many farms, in addition to the higher meal cost, there was also substantially more forage purchased and fed on those farms. So it won't have, on some farms there was no forage bought, and on other farms there were substantial quantities of stuff like whole crop grain, whole crop cereals bought, or bought in silage and hay to try and make up the forage deficits that are prevalent on farms. Talking to some of the people who were attending the National Forestry or National Forage Advisory workshops in the last couple of weeks, what we're being told is that on average the discrepancy or the forage deficit is 5%, but it's only on a third of farms, and on those farms it's a significant 15% deficit, which is quite scary. It's more than you'd like to see, more than you'd be comfortable with, because a 15% deficit based on 140 days is a 3 week shortfall on a third of farms in the country. So extra costs have been incurred. On some farms it was only extra meal. On many farms it was both meal and forage. And the after effects will be seen up to the early summer of the coming year. And I say lots of people will be hoping in those regions that were most affected, they'll be hoping for an early spring.
I suppose, taking all of what we've discussed into account, George, can you kind of condense, say, the target areas for people to achieve these lower costs and higher output on farms? Okay,
so to achieve kind of lower costs and higher output on farm, we're talking about a highly fertile herd of cows that calve compactly in the spring. The cows are turned out onto Index 3 P and K farms with 0% of the area at low pH. They'll be fed, we would expect maximum of 4 kilos of meal in the spring. They'll peak at around 27 to 30 litres, and they'll have a long and sustained peak yield across March, April and May. Deliver between 450 and 500 kilos of milk solid per cow on between half a tonne and 3/4 of a tonne of meal. That milk will be of high composition, and the cows will be dried off from mid-November through to mid-December.
So just to recap, George, I think fertility was your big point at the start. So we're talking a fertile cow and also fertile soils. Placing
fertile cow and fertile soil delivering healthy profits at farm level.
And then, focusing on grass, getting the grass into the cow, achieving a high level of milk production across maybe 10 months of the year. So, compact calving will give a long lactation, and tying things up nicely where things are slowing down on farm in November, December, giving the cow and the farmer a break.
Absolutely, a well-deserved break.
Thanks, George.
You're welcome, Louise.
That's it for this week's episode of the Dairy Edge podcast, and my thanks to George Ramsbottom for joining me on this week's show. Don't forget to subscribe on Apple and Google Podcasts as well as Spotify, and for more information go to the Teagasc website at teagasc.ie. I'm Emma Louise Coffey, and join me next time for your Dairy Edge.